Let's move to our next story now, and I'm afraid the situation doesn't get much better. Let's move to West Asia, where there is, unfortunately, now talk of a third intifada. In other words, another rebellion or uprising. Let's just recap some of this week's events. The U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was in West Asia. He met the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Also, the President of Palestine, Mahmoud Abbas. Blinken was not the first American official to recently land in Israel. The White House National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, was in Israel earlier this month. So was the CIA Director, William Burns. So why are all these officials jetting off to West Asia? Because there's a crisis. There's rising violence, both in the West Bank and in Jerusalem. The Israeli Defense Forces are raiding refugee camps. Palestinian gunmen are firing inside synagogues. There are terrorist attacks that are taking place in synagogues, and people are dying. People are dying on both sides, but there's been a particularly brutal terror attack right now. All of this is bringing back the shadows of another intifada, another Palestinian uprising. Let's quickly recap some history, if we can, for you about the intifadas. The first intifada, or the first Palestinian uprising, began in 1987. This was after an Israeli Defense Force truck collided with a civilian car, resulting in the death of 4 Palestinians. Protests and civil disobedience then followed. They went on for months. They went on for years. Then these demonstrations turned violent more often than not. The first intifada lasted 5 years, killing nearly 2,000 people. The second intifada began in September 2000. This was after Ariel Sharon, the then Israeli opposition leader, made a visit to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The site is considered the third holiest in Islam, so Palestinians did not take this visit very lightly. Angry demonstrators gathered on the streets. The months that followed saw targeted killings, aerial attacks, suicide bombings, stone pelting, terror attacks, rocket attacks from both sides. The second intifada believed to have killed nearly 4,000 people. So, as you may have figured out, intifada, a period of uprising accompanied by high casualties, and that's not something that Israel wants, it's not something that the Middle East wants. Now, recent polls are showing that 61% of Palestinians and 65% of Israeli Jews think a third intifada is on the horizon. And that's bad news. Are they wrong? Has the cycle of violence already begun? And is the Israeli government doing everything it can to stop it, or is it in fact encouraging it? Now, following last week's spate of violence, Netanyahu's office announced a range of, quote, additional deterrent measures, unquote. What measures? Well, revoking Jerusalem residents' rights of families of militants, stripping their social security, stripping their health benefits. Earlier this week, we saw homes being bulldozed. Moreover, the Israeli government has now pledged to expedite gun permits for Israeli citizens, basically arm more Israelis. Many of these measures are actually considered illegal under international law. But the Israeli authorities right now don't sound as if they really care, because it's often being said by critics, the current Israeli cabinet is perhaps the most far-right ever. Many critics say it is actually a group of religious and ultra-nationalist politicians, and that could have its own impact. A member of the cabinet, Itamar Ben-Gvir, began this year by visiting the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. Hamas called the move a red line. Analysts essentially are now fearing that all of these things that are happening, and the so-called deterrence, and of course the terror attack, let's not forget the terror attack that we've just seen, all of this could trigger an escalation in tension. And if that happens, it's not going to be good for anybody. And then, of course, you can have a blame game. You can say it's the Palestinian Authority to blame, or the Israeli government is to be blamed, but an escalation of violence is not going to be good news. And there are signs of this happening. Earlier this week, an exchange of fire between Israel and people in the Gaza Strip. Israeli aircraft struck a rocket production workshop in the Gaza Strip. This was after rockets were fired into Israel from Gaza. So a critical question at this point is, where does this escalation and the recent developments leave the two-states solution? So let me put this to Fleur Hassan Nahum, who's the Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, and that's where she's joining us from. Thank you so much for joining us, and WION, ma'am. The last thing I think anybody would want is a third intifada or a rise in violence. How do you see the situation? Is there likely to be an escalation?
Well, we had a very, very difficult, tragic weekend last weekend where 8 innocent people were gunned down outside a place of worship, outside a synagogue, indiscriminately. The following day, as you know, we saw two innocent people walking around killed by a 13-year-old, gunned down on the street. Unfortunately, one of the victims looks like his situation is getting worse. And unfortunately, we see these flare-ups every now and again. I am an optimist by nature. I don't believe there's going to be a third intifada, because I believe that the Palestinian Authority is losing legitimacy amongst its own people. They're a government who hasn't provided anything, any basic thing to their people. Jobs, decent healthcare. They are autonomous in their regions, and yet they provide nothing. And so I don't think they have the credibility of the leadership right now to be able to coordinate a curated intifada against us. And of course, our security and our defense establishment is strong, and we have our finger on the pulse at every moment. So I would like to believe that this is not going to escalate, that unfortunately we have these flare-ups, and we have to continue being vigilant to quell the flare-ups of terrorism that we have now and again.
Yeah, I guess one of the biggest problems is there becomes a vicious cycle, and a cycle of blame and of accusations. We heard what you said. You'll hear people on the Palestinian Authority and the other side saying that, yes, it's a far-right government in Israel and they are the ones who are fanning the violence. That then leads to its own dynamics, and that's when violence can escalate.
You can't make a moral equivalence between rooting out terrorists when you know of an impending attack and gunning down innocent people on the street. There's no cycle here. What we have is, unfortunately, the Palestinian leadership, which has never really ideologically accepted that Israel exists. This doesn't come from any type of situation other than the fact that the Palestinians, and it doesn't matter with which government, people are talking about the government now. What was the problem with the government in the early 2000s that offered the Palestinian leadership everything they said they wanted? What was the problem with a left-wing government that came in a couple of years later that offered them even more of what they said they wanted? And what was the problem with successive governments that were not right? Some of them were even left, and we're still in the same situation. And the situation comes from one very clear reason, and that is the Palestinian leadership cannot say, have not ideologically or emotionally accepted that Israel is not going anywhere, that Israel is here to stay, and we have the legitimate right to be a country, a homeland for the Jewish people. That is the root of the problem. It's not about any type of cycle of violence, it's about acceptance.
Is there, as the solution is searched for, and a solution has been hard to find, of course, for a very, very long period of time, how concerned are you as the Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem that there could be another upsurge of terrorism, of violence, of once again, people having to look over their shoulders and worry about when the next suicide attack could come or the next bomb blast could come? What is your own expectation in the weeks and months ahead?
Well, we are actually one of the safest capital cities in the world. We have very low crime. And like I said earlier, we worry about flare-ups now and again of violent terrorist crime. But we are a secure city. We are connected to the security forces, to cameras. People here are vigilant. And ultimately, I don't think we're going to see return to suicide bombs, because I don't think people are stupid enough now to believe that killing themselves is going to bring any type of solution. And I think people have stopped believing their own leadership, that this is somehow leading to some type of solution.
All right, thank you so much for joining us for that. I'm going to be in Jerusalem in just a couple of weeks from now, so maybe we'll get a chance to come across and
we look forward to having you.
Experiencing that for myself. Thank you so much for joining us on WION. Thank you.